Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Woo! Yes, we can see you.
Yay.
All right, we miss you so much, Lisa.
Oh, okay, I'm gonna share my screen.
Put it in slideshow.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Do you see the actual presenter view?
You can actually see the view as it is meant to be seen.
Perfect.
Hold on just 1 second. Let me see if I can. I don't think anyone here is reading the transcript, right? No. So I just want to see if I can close the transcript. No?
Close it. Can you click and drag it down?
Yeah. So right here. Oh, perfect. Okay. Yes. I'm so proud of myself. I did a mouse thing on a Mac. Okay. So Lisa, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
All right. Go ahead.
Great. Oh, there's a little echo from me. Okay, maybe not now. So thank you all for the invitation. I want to thank the organizers for the invitation. I am so sorry I could not be there. It was in the plans, and then life happened, and June is just not good for me. But I really appreciate the flexibility of being able to do this virtually. And already I have learned so much from the first two presentations. You guys are definitely hardcore, really smart people. So I hope that I can give something to this conference, and something will resonate with someone out there. So I'm going to be focused on within group studies because that's what I've been doing for, a long time now. And Jen asked me to kind of address 3 broad questions in the time I have with you. And so that's what I'm going to try to do. Let me see if I can move this out of the way. Okay. So as a sort of an overview of what I'll talk about today, I want to give first 2 disclaimers before I start. First, these are really just my thoughts and opinions about why within race or within ethnic group studies are important and needed. They don't reflect the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center views. They don't reflect some of my colleagues' views. It's just, based on my experience over the past couple decades. And the other thing is, I study African Americans, I work with African Americans. So that's the lens for much of what I would talk about today. But I think most of what I discuss applies to other marginalized groups in the US. So I think, these constructs will resonate with other groups as well. So Jen wanted me to address 3 main questions. Why do we still require or expect white comparison groups when we're studying a single minoritized group? And so I wanted to give sort of a historical context of race studies. And then, she said, well, how do we justify these types of within group analyses? And I'll just give a couple of examples of how I think we can justify, but I really want your feedback on this because I have constantly been fighting this battle with reviewers, grant reviewers, people who read my papers, editors. It's been a constant battle of having to always fight, like, why are you just studying Black people? So I've tried to come up with some arguments, but I know there are others out there, and especially these really smart epidemiologists, please give me something. And then I'll just end with, how I think these within group designs can advance our research, because I think they can be really powerful for identifying culturally specific psychosocial factors that impact heterogeneity in aging, because they will offer unique narratives in some cases that you won't be able to really address when you do between group studies. So, when we start with the question of why white comparison groups are still expected for studies with minoritized populations? I think the simple answer is one that we've heard, already. The simple answer is racism. But we have to step back because we know that majority white population is always seen as the norm. But if we step back and view science from a broader perspective, it sort of makes sense about where we are right now. So there's the construct of ethnocentrism, which is the tendency to evaluate other ethnic groups by the standards and behavior and qualities displayed in one's own ethnic group. Now, ethnocentrism in and of itself is not a form of racism because it does not always involve a power dynamic. But there are at least two manifestations of ethnocentrism when you add power and a belief that differences are innate. And that one of them is white supremacy, this intricate web of laws and norms. And it's been defined as a system of racialized power. White people's values, beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors are centered as normative. They're believed to be and treated as superior to other, typically Black people's values, beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. And the other manifestation of this is structural racism, which we've heard, a little bit about already. The totality of ways by which society fosters racial discrimination and white supremacy through mutually reinforcing inequitable systems in housing, education, employment, healthcare, criminal justice, and other domains. And this is a definition advanced by Zinzi Bailey, who I now have the great fortune of being able to work with on a grant about structural racism. So this enduring principle of white over Black supported slavery, it supported Jim Crow, and really defined Black people as racially inferior and subordinate in every way. So these racially comparative approaches, by their very nature, set up a deficits approach to understanding disparities, subconsciously normalizing the experiences of the dominant white population. But we can look at the study of race historically to really understand where this comes from. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here, but most of the research between the 1800s and the 1980s were really focused on studying race on cultural and or genetic deficits. So you have, the famous drapetomania in 1851, a Louisiana surgeon, Samuel Cartwright. He filed a report in the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal on disease prevalence among the South Black population. And he termed the name of this syndrome as drapetomania, which really was a form of mania supposedly affecting slaves, manifested by an uncontrollable impulse to wander or run away from the white masters. And then we had the craniometry in the 1800s, which I know the neuropsychologists in the room are well aware of, which supposedly proved that white people were biologically superior to Blacks by measuring human skulls. And then you had the Moynihan report in 1965, named after the Secretary of Labor, Daniel Patrick Moynihan at that time, 1965. He discussed racial inequality primarily in terms of family structure. Basically, that the overabundance of female-headed households was the reason that there was so much racial inequality. So these flawed, biased studies, failed to account for political and social factors that we now know, are important, like poor housing, poverty, lack of health care, and, racial oppression. But importantly, these types of studies located the problem within the impacted group. And it didn't take into account fundamental causes that we talk about today, the social determinants of health. And it didn't acknowledge the potential protective factors that may confer resilience. And so, despite the changing demographics, with the diverse populations, growing at a much more rapid pace than any of the other populations, these minoritized groups are still considered minority in our research on disparities. And for those who study Alzheimer's and Alzheimer's related dementias, we always hear the glaring statistic that certain groups are more at risk. So African Americans are 2 times more likely. Latinos are 1.5 more times likely. So, but the groups that are supposedly disproportionately burdened are under-included in clinical research studies. So this was a report that looked at maybe 8 large studies to sort of get a landscape view of what we know in the field of Alzheimer's. And they, showed this graph that almost 80% of research participants are whites. So almost everything we know about Alzheimer's disease is really coming from a predominantly, white samples. And we don't know whether the research findings mean the same thing in our underrepresented populations. And it really limits the evidence base for translating findings into clinical care. So this in itself is a real disparity. And although we've come a long way since the 1800s, early 19 up to 1980 maybe, particularly in our appreciation for the social determinants of health as fundamental causes of disparities, the practices continue to be rooted in white supremacy at all stages of the research process. So, I have just a few examples on the slide, ranging from passive recruitment strategies that are not centered in communities of color, inclusion, exclusion criteria that favor white participants, like, requiring that you can't have comorbidities, you have to have access to transportation, you have to adhere to a certain schedule during the day. There are a lot of the differences are still framed as individual deficits or deficiencies without acknowledging systemic factors that I've talked about. And, we compare urban people of color facing poverty in many cases to suburban white middle class persons. And we, try to make comparisons in that way. And I think, the most egregious thing for me, as I've been doing this work, since I first got my study funded, is requiring or expecting a white control group to validate study findings, and it's the criticism is never about, you need a comparison group so you can have a better scientific study. It is usually, how do you know this is really true? Because you don't have a white comparison group to validate your finding. You don't have a gold standard. And so I think this is a problem in the field. And I hope that, you all in the room and on Zoom are the scholars that will help change, shift this paradigm in our thinking. I would just say that, this type of thinking is, also extends to, these challenges extend to what's happening in the workforce, right? We know that there is a dramatic underrepresentation of Latinos and Hispanic Latinos, Black or African Americans. This slide is showing you the underrepresentation as it relates to NIH R01 grants, where you can see the light blue bar are the population in 2019 for the different groups, and the sort of like middle, I don't know what color that is, aqua or something, that's the STEM workforce, and then the dark blue are the R01 equivalent awardees. And you can see that, it's pretty even for whites, and for Asians, they are actually overrepresented as far as R01 awardees. But you can see for Hispanics and Blacks, there really is this disparity in who is getting these awards. And this is a problem because these are the people in many cases that have the narrative lens to ask the types of questions that we need to advance the field. And so we're really missing out on some great talent when we have this type of disparity. So, turning to my second question, how do we justify, how have I tried to justify the within group analyses? And again, this is where I need your feedback, because I really, I'm struggling here when I try to fight back, but I think the number one thing that I try to argue is that there's this complexity of culture. The assumption of homogeneity when we look at these minoritized groups really erases the complexity and full humanity of diverse people. And I think it magnifies differences between certain groups of people and the white majority group. I created this word cloud. I learned how to do that. And I just looked at the literature of like the past 5 years and pulled out terms that were associated with, diversity and people doing health equity work. And I'm sure I didn't even scratch the surface, but you can see that there are so many different variables, that to take into account when you're doing this kind of work. And, Justina will talk about intersectionality, that's her domain. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about just the vast amount of heterogeneity that exists in these minoritized groups, but they're often treated like they are a monolith and that we can just lump everybody together and, and look at these differences across race and ethnicity. Just a few examples of how this plays out, you can see that there are differences, even though a lot of times we lump Latinos together. There are differences in Alzheimer's disease prevalence and incidence between Caribbean Hispanic Americans, who tend to have a much higher prevalence or incidence of Alzheimer's, compared to Mexican Americans, who have a much lower prevalence. But yet we lump them together as Latinos and we say, oh, there's a 1.5 higher risk of Alzheimer's in this group. The data on African Americans and Caribbean Blacks is a little bit thinner, but I was able to find 2 studies. One showed that Caribbean Black adults had lower performance on the modified symbol digits modality test compared to African Americans and non-Latino whites using the National Survey of American Life. And another one by which Jen was the senior author that looked at, that found the influence of age and education on neuropsychological test performance was attenuated in Caribbean-born versus US-born African-American elderly. And of course, the great Kaiser data, one of the few groups that's really able to look at subgroups of Asians, because most prior work has really focused, at least in the US, has focused on Japanese Americans because of the 2 really large cohort studies that we have in America, or they lump Asian Americans all into one group. But you can see that there are differences in dementia incidence, based on which subgroup you're in. So these things are often just sort of glossed over. In our own work, we know that if you just look at African Americans from the Midwest, where we tend to have fewer numbers of Caribbean Blacks in the Midwest, at least in Chicago. So in our studies, African Americans, are the people who migrated up, who came over in the slave trade and migrated up from the South. We find that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the underlying pathology that causes dementia. And it's not based on your racial background. It's based on selection bias, who shows up at a memory clinic because they have some type of complaint. It's not always memory based. It could be, based in behavior problems, but this heterogeneity exists. And, we also can see heterogeneity in genetic effects. And I really like showing this paper because it really opened up my eyes. So not this paper, but the next one I'm going to show. But this is an area where we have been doing a lot of work trying to understand the effect of ApoE4 allele. We know it's a potent risk factor for Alzheimer's in whites. It doesn't seem to be as strong in African Americans, but we know that this neighboring gene called TOM40. And there's a lot of a lot of controversy about TOM40. And, I didn't really know why there was so much controversy until I really started, reading more and talking to colleagues. But, it really is because TOM40 and the ApoE4 are in linkage disequilibrium in whites. They're right on top of each other. They have the same effects. As you can see here, this is risk of Alzheimer's. You can't even separate them out. And because most genetic studies only include whites, that we thought that was it. That's the dogma. The TOM40 is not doing anything. But if you look at the effect in Blacks, you see there's a very different pattern of E4 and the TOM40 gene. And I had the pleasure of working with Casey Dieters, who was a postdoc at Stanford at the time. She was really interested in understanding genetic effect, racial differences and genetic effects. And so she had the great idea, like, let's map out the TOM40 haplotypes across race and, in your cohorts. And, what you can see on the slide, that people who have the E3 allele, if you compare Blacks and whites, you see the same pattern where whites have, short and long and Blacks have the same pattern here, short and long for E3. But if you look at E4 alleles, there's a very different pattern of the Tom 40 gene, where whites really have their clusters in the 20 to 30 range, but Black African Americans have a short range here. And when she actually looked at the haplotype patterns to see how it affected cognitive decline, she found that it was actually the short range that was protective in African Americans, which is the blue and red lines. So having, either one or two of those alleles, Blacks who had that had a slower rate of cognitive decline compared to Blacks who did not have the short pattern. The ones who did not have the short pattern, they look just like whites. And because we know that, African Americans in this country are very admixed, this is probably a big reason why we're seeing that the ApoE4 effects are muted in this population, because there's a neighboring gene that is also exerting effects that we never take into account because we thought it was just doing what it does in whites. So, I think, those are sort of the arguments that I've tried to advance, that there's a lot of heterogeneity, that, minoritized groups are not a monolith. And what I don't have a slide for, but I think another argument that I've tried to advance is that so there's some questions you just cannot ask in every group. Because of structural racism and how people are positioned in our society, there are some experiences that are not universal, and it does not make any sense to try to ask it in populations that haven't experienced it, or to ignore it and not understand what's happening in these minoritized groups. So those are sort of the things that I've tried to advance as far as why, as a justification for why these kinds of designs are important. And so now in the last part, I just want to talk about, what does it mean to center diversity, or center these within group designs? So, I don't want you to get the idea from this presentation that I'm saying within group designs are better or, are more important for health equity. The theme of your conference is best practices, for cognitive aging and health equity, issues. And so I really believe that within group designs should complement between group designs. Between group designs can play an important role in documenting disparities, mobilizing resources to reduce disparities, right? So we really need the between group designs. But it's important that in those instances that race and ethnicity are seen as proxies for structural factors, and disparities are conceptualized as differences rooted in social inequities. When people start to make other conceptualizations based on the differences that they see, that's when we get into trouble. And I think that within group designs allows researchers to identify salient cultural factors, and to extend theories about the human experience that are believed to be universal, but have only really been tested within majority white samples. And, we have all kinds of examples, of culturally relevant factors. Some of these certainly can be examined between groups, and you would have a continuum of endorsement on these different factors. But there are some that you probably never would think to examine in a white group and try to look across race to understand a disparity. And I think, depending on your research question, you have to make that judgment yourself. But and this is not even all of the possible factors, but these are some of the ones that I have pulled out of the literature, from studies like the Jackson Hart study, people who are really doing this kind of work really thoughtfully and really trying to move the needle on us understanding health equity at a deeper level. And I think, the NIA Health Disparities Framework, I know Jen showed maybe 2 or 3 different frameworks. I really like this one. Because it really, gives us direct targets in each of the domains of what we can address. And it really tries to take a life course perspective, because we know that these disparities, they're not, or these different factors, they happen across a person's life course. They don't just show up in old age, the period that we happen to be studying. They have been around, since before the person came out of the womb. And so we have to be able to take all of those things into account. And so, I want to just, briefly just talk to you about how we've tried to do this in our own work. Because even if you don't do within group studies, or you are only using secondary data analysis, you're not, actually the person doing the primary data collection, I think you should still have to appreciate what goes into collecting this data, because it just gives you a better grounding in the types of questions you're answering or trying to answer, and so in our work, for us, it has to be community-centered recruitment and retention, because we know the history of these minoritized groups when it comes to science and research and medical care. And so we spend a lot of time in the communities trying to build trust and really partnering with people so that we can ask the right questions, like what's important in the aging process, how was your childhood, so it's coupling, this sort of research partnership with the rigorous, longitudinal, epi type designs, but really trying to bring into bear this sort of engagement with communities so we can get more of a richer appreciation, and because in my particular studies, I'm also trying to get autopsy from my participants. I have to keep people in the study, until they die. And so, we really try hard to come up with culturally celebratory retention events to keep people interested and engaged and feeling like they are giving something bigger than what they are, they're involved in something bigger than themselves, something that's going to really help their communities. And, one of our really most important tenets, I think, is that, we're giving first and we're trying to meet community needs, which, really was amplified during COVID, so we held, laundromat fairs, to help wash essential workers' clothes that, couldn't work remotely, and we held, free COVID testing and vaccines, all of these kinds of things, because it's not just about the research for us, it's really about making the community better and really trying to get at the root of some of these problems. And so, because of all of these types of efforts that we've built over the years, we can then answer important questions, of these cultural experiences or cultural risk factors, and so we've looked at discrimination, which is a very important psychosocial stressor for African Americans, at a host of different outcomes, and I will say that we have found quite a bit in this area, but this is a mixed literature. There's still much more to be learned. Even within the Kaiser databases, we're not seeing the same types of things with discrimination. And so it doesn't mean it's not a good question to ask. It means that there are other things we're not considering. Are there regional effects, segregation, things like that we need to be taken into account. So, by taking a broader perspective, reading outside of your literature, bringing in different perspectives in a multidisciplinary fashion, you can ask different questions. So we've been able to look at, discrimination and school segregation, which I'm not going to go over. I know people have heard my presentations ad nauseum, so I'm not going to bore you with that. But we have, been able to look at discrimination with mental health and with, things you can measure in the blood, things you can measure in the brain, to try to understand how a social marker can actually get under the skin to affect health, and then being even broader than, something like specifically like discrimination, looking at stress-related factors like, perceived stress and, John Henryism, seeing how those things affect cognition and brain aging in our African Americans. And finally, there are a number of really unique questions that we can never get at with surveys. And, we had the honor really of recruiting Dr. Crystal Glover to our group about, 5 or 6 years ago. And she does mixed methods work. She's a social psychologist, but, she was able to bring her methods and her approaches to, our very, traditional applied, survey research methodology to help us address issues and questions that might have been really sensitive, or, around under inclusion, or, or, clinical trial participation, and her work has helped us understand some of the unique factors that are not being picked up in our current survey methodology. And it's also helped us create materials, educational materials for the families, for the participants, so that, we can work together with the community as partners to really move the needle in health equity research. So I've gotten such a greater appreciation for qualitative and mixed methods work, because I wasn't trained in that, obviously, but it's really adding so much to our research portfolios, and we're just really very grateful that we have Crystal on our team. And I think the last thing that I'll just say is that, this kind of work, is also grounded in being able to grow a pipeline of people interested in health equity and health disparities, because you're going to attract people who want to help their community, who want to answer these questions. So we've been able to, really get great talent and people who have these cultural lenses that we need to be able to come up with these kinds of questions. Because, again, we're not a monolith, and my experience as a Black woman is not going to be the same as another Black woman on my team, who might be, have a completely different background than I do. So it really takes a whole multidisciplinary team working together to address some of these questions. So I am going to just end with, I hope, time for questions by just a few points. I think a one-size-fits-all model or approach to our science is really rooted in structural racism and white supremacy. And it attends less to the important heterogeneity or within group variability that exists within these minoritized groups. Comparative work is certainly important, but it should not establish a hierarchy where one group is positioned as the gold standard or norm. That is what I see in so many papers. And I think that we need to, to change that. And I think centering research on historically excluded populations, paying more attention to those kinds of research questions will enrich our science and advance knowledge on cognitive aging and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And of course, I am always happy to work with anybody, especially really smart epidemiologists like you all, to, ask deeper questions, to, run fancy models to answer things. So, please reach out and please, look at the data that we have, whether you're interested in, social factors, biology, genetics, whatever. We have tons of data that we're willing to share. So thank you, and I'll stop there.
Lisa, you killed it. That was awesome. I know you couldn't hear. There's a lot of, claps and yeses and, laughs and relief, and you're really speaking the truth, what
Good
here in the room.
I didn't know if I was going to have tomatoes thrown at me.
Well, yeah,
like the reviewers do.
I think not only it may be that you're speaking to the choir, but you're also giving us language that we didn't necessarily have before to express the rationale for why to do these studies and why they're so important. So thank you so much. You are really an inspiration. This. You're an inspiration for me and a lot of people in the room.
Thank you.
Yeah, we love you. So we're going to have people come up and ask questions. I propose we have a 10-minute question and answer period. And we know you need to go right after that, so I'm really going to cut it at that point. Then we're going to have lunch, and lunch will run for an hour, just to let people know. So
there's also one question in the chat for Lisa.
Okay, there's a question in the chat for you, Lisa. Do you see it?
Yeah, I can see it. I don't know if I can answer it, but I can see it.
Okay. Read it out for us. And
okay,
then come on up to queue up.
Okay, the Tom 40 paper is, let's see, what's this from? Isabel Yanatos. The Tom 40 paper is super interesting and emphasizes the importance of diversity in genetic studies. I'm wondering why you compare genetics between racial groups rather than between ancestry backgrounds. That's a great question. I think Casey also looked at that because she is interested in the percentage of African ancestry and how that is protective or not against Alzheimer's. It didn't end up in that paper, but I think she was following the first paper that compared Blacks and whites, and so that's the model that she followed. But I know that she also looked at some papers that actually had Tom 40 data for Africans. And that's how she realized that there was this different cluster that was very similar to what we saw in Africa. I think it was maybe Nigerians. I can't remember quite the details right now. But that's an excellent question. I think maybe that's something that might end up in another paper. But I think because she was focusing on Black-white differences based on the first paper is why she did it that way.
So you got a thumbs up from Casey, who's in the room.
Oh, Casey could have answered that.
I know. I texted you that she's there, but you didn't see my text. Okay.
No, hey, Casey.
All right. Next up is Whitney Robinson.
Hi.
Hi.
Love your question about like, how do we convince people that this kind of work is valuable as far as like your within group studies? And I think your point about like, there are some questions literally that just make sense within this population. So if you're in an epi study section, you can talk about positivity and structural confounding. I feel like, you could like throw in your keywords. And I feel like also a point that I don't know you made explicitly, but you kind of implicate this idea of cross-validation. Like different groups have different confounding patterns and have different patterns of bias. And you need to sometimes look deeply within groups just to see what's happening in different groups using the best bias reduction methods you can. Like, are you seeing the same things? And I think you get more robust findings when you can do cross-validation and triangulation. And I feel like, maybe it'll convince somebody.
Okay, Whitney, I definitely need you because all of these things you're saying is giving me life. I did not have the language to use, to say these kinds of things, but a lot of our work goes to epi journals. So I think this is excellent. And please, I don't know you, haven't met you in person, but I love you and I want to find you and you please help me.
Okay. All right. Come on up.
Hi there, Dr. Barnes. My name is Emily Morris. I'm a PhD student in clinical psych at University of Michigan. And I thank you again so much for your talk today. It was so great. And I just wanted I would love to hear your thoughts about the importance of within group work when it comes to identifying and measuring positive psychosocial factors or protective psychosocial factors that we can kind of work on emphasizing or improving to help protect against ADRD. I know that's like a special line of your work that overlaps with mine, so I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, some of the things that I talked about, I think it's really important within group studies to do that kind of work specifically because most of the research really focuses on deficits and risk factors, because, Alzheimer's is a terrible disease, right? So we're trying to figure out what causes it, but there are lots of people who are aging, who don't have Alzheimer's. So how do we figure out what are some of those resilience factors, and we just don't have a lot of resilience markers in the literature. I mean, there's some, we have purpose in life and, we have, some of the behavioral risk factors that we know are protective. But I think in, looking at within group studies is really when we need to work with our mixed methods and our qualitative research colleagues, because that's how we're going to uncover some of those things that are not being tapped by some of these survey measures, things that we hear about in other literatures as important, like spirituality, the role of positive family functioning, all of these concepts. I don't know if there are great survey measures. There's some certainly, but there are some nuances that we can't pick up just by some of these questions that we're asking now. And I think having a within group design allows you to work directly with the population and find out, just ask them specifically, like, what are some things that that help you cope, or, where do you find sources of strength? I think asking the question in different ways will allow us to pull out some of these concepts, and then we can work to maybe turn them into a more quantitative measure. But maybe that's not even important. Maybe it's more important to get the construct out through mixed methods, and then start really using some of this structural equation modeling or whatever else we need to do to be able to see where the relationships are. But I think that there's not enough emphasis on that right now in the field. And we are mostly focused on, and I've been guilty of this too, focusing a lot on those things like discrimination and, and segregation, the things that have been really bad for people. But, one of the things that I found in another study that I worked on, the Chicago Health and Aging Project, is that, the Black people who are still in the study, who, are living to 80s and 90s, they are different. They are much more resilient, much more hardy, and our measures are not tapping into that enough. And so, if you have ideas about some resilience markers that we should be looking at, I'm open to that. But that is definitely an area that I'm trying to go more into to understand resilience markers and just how we can understand healthy aging.
Yeah, thank you so much for your perspective on that. I really appreciate it.
I wish I could see you guys.
Our camera makes a little glitchy.
I know. It's just like talking to a black box.
Yeah, yes, I will do it. Yeah, let's do it. And maybe Alden, you can turn on your camera and show everybody. Yeah, cool. Go ahead, Elizabeth Rose.
Okay. Hi, Lisa. It's Elizabeth Rose.
Hi.
Well, it's good to see you. Thank you so much for your time.
There's a lot of you out there.
And I'm so nervous about whether I can articulate what I want to ask. So I'm going to try. So, do you have any, based on your experience within group studies, do you have any recommendations for when if you're trying to launch a cohort study in a minoritized population that isn't represented in the status quo research, and we have a 5-year grant cycle, and we really want to measure cognitive change, and we want to go into the community and build trust and try to really identify how to build trust and recruit the population we're interested in. How do you kind of balance thinking about these 5-year grant cycles and establishing the cohorts and generating the long-term data that you want?
Yeah, it's a great question, Elizabeth Rose. And I know one that a lot of people really struggle with. I don't have any great recommendations. It takes a lot of time to do this work. I don't think it can be done in a 1 5-year grant cycle. I think that my study has been funded since 2004. So we're year 16 to 20 now. And but before I got funded, I was actually working in the community years before that, building relationships, building trust, working with the community to understand, what was important to them. And so that by the time I got funded, I was sort of able to hit the ground running, but I had to do all this work, behind the scenes until I got funded. And the other thing I did during that time, which, I tell, junior investigators, is I worked on another issue that was very similar to racial differences. I looked at gender differences in, our majority white population, so that I could check all those boxes that I needed to be able to go up for tenure and have, productivity, so I could actually get the grant, So I think, it's sort of using different strategies, but there's no substitution for putting in the time and effort it takes. I can't sugarcoat it. It's hard, and it takes, especially with these communities that haven't been represented, haven't been given a voice, it takes time in the community working with them, And one thing I like to tell people is that when I first started my cohort, the first 5-year cycle, I was only trying to get 350 people, right? And I know I didn't get any papers out of my own cohort that first grant cycle. So I had to leverage other publications in other areas. But one of the things that I did that sort of created a groundswell for the building of the trust piece with these populations was We visit everyone in their home to collect the data. We never have them come to Rush. But what I did was I incorporated a visit from me at the end of each RA. The RA goes out, the nurse goes out, and then I would go out, and the phlebotomist goes out. Then I would go out at the very end to thank them, to go over their cognitive testing results, to answer questions, blah, 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 all those things. And just that one visit with every single person in the cohort completely changed everything for what we were able to do going forward, because then they had a face that they could associate with the research. They had me, and they looked at me as, coming from their own culture, representing them, and feeling like I was their granddaughter asking the right questions. Now, that's not to say that if you're not of that culture, you can't do this work. I think it was really about relationship building, life-to-life connections that really allowed me to create a cohort now that's, been in existence for almost 20 years, and now, 800 people, half of them give me their brain, but that was all because I had to put in the extra work, behind the scenes and before the scenes. So I guess the short answer to your question is there is no easy route. You cannot do it in 5 years. And so I think, but persistence and just sticking with it are the keys to be able to have a cohort. And, because you have the Kaiser cohort, you can get so much data out and have so much productivity while you're working on the side to build a cohort. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Lisa.
All right. Lisa, we're going to let you go. You see a lot of props coming from the chat. You see, I hope you saw all of our appreciation and heard our appreciation here. You see people waving. Everyone wants to say hi.
I really want to come to Friday Harbor.
We're going to have to do this next time. Next time,